He was just a steelworker in Detroit. They thought he knew nothing beyond rust and fire. But when the company announced the factory's closure, he pulled out numbers that Wall Street itself couldn't ignore. The sun had not yet risen above the gray skyline of Detroit when Jack Morley tightened the strap of his dented hard hat and stepped into the factory gates. He was 58 years old, his shoulders bent by 3 decades of lifting steel beams and inhaling the furnace smoke that clung to his lungs like a permanent scar. His boots were cracked, his hands covered in lines carved by time and labor, yet every step carried the same steady rhythm, as if the machines themselves had taught him how to walk. The factory was alive before dawn. Sparks danced from welding torches, conveyor belts rattled like restless bones, and the furnace roared with the hunger of fire. For most men, it was chaos. For Jack, it was music. He knew the cadence of every hammer, the sigh of every pipe. To others, this was just noise. To him, it was a living equation. In his pocket, folded and worn thin, was a piece of paper he carried every shift. On it were numbers, ratios of ore to output, graphs sketched by a pencil stub, tiny calculations squeezed into margins darkened by grease. No one had ever seen it. During lunch breaks, when others played cards or argued about the Lions, Jack would sit in a quiet corner, his calloused fingers tracing formulas as if he were praying. The men laughed at him sometimes. "What are you doing, Jack? Writing poetry to the furnace?" He would smile faintly and keep writing. He had learned long ago that genius, when it was born in the wrong place, was often mistaken for madness. The truth was simple, though nobody asked. Jack had been watching. For 30 years he had recorded the invisible tides of steel. He knew how the price of iron ore shifted when construction slowed in Asia. He knew how the furnace's appetite grew leaner in February, when the city's demand dipped. He could predict the rise and fall of the market the way a sailor reads the sea. He did not have a degree. He did not have a title. He had the patience of a man who had stood at the same machine for half his life. That morning, however, something was different. The bulletin board at the entrance bore a fresh sheet of paper, stamped with the company's seal. The words were sharp, merciless. "Effective immediately. Morley Steel Plant will begin a 6-month wind-down of operations, with complete closure scheduled by year's end." Jack stood still, the roar of the factory fading to a hum. Around him, men cursed under their breath, tore the paper down, or simply walked away in silence. Some already knew what it meant. Mortgages unpaid, kids pulled from college, families broken. Detroit had seen it before. Another plant closing, another neighborhood hollowed out, another story of men discarded when the numbers no longer fit the boardroom's vision. But Jack's eyes did not cloud with despair. Instead, they narrowed. He read the announcement again. 6 months. Wind down. He felt the edges of that folded paper in his pocket, the one with calculations no one believed in. The plant wasn't dying because it couldn't survive. It was being sacrificed, carved up to satisfy an equation someone in a glass tower had scribbled without ever smelling iron or touching fire. Jack clenched the paper in his fist. For 30 years he had kept silent, letting his numbers remain ghosts in a notebook. But as he looked at the weary faces of men who had built this city with their hands, he felt something shift inside him. Perhaps it was anger. Perhaps it was duty. Or perhaps it was the quiet realization that he was running out of time, that if he didn't speak now, the story of his life would end in silence. At the lunch whistle, the men gathered in the break room. The air was heavy with defeat. One worker, younger than Jack's own son, slammed his fist on the table. "They don't give a damn about us. We're done." Jack cleared his throat. The room went quiet, not out of respect, but surprise. Jack rarely spoke. "What if," he said slowly, "they're wrong?" The men stared. "Wrong? Jack, it's over. They've got the numbers. Wall Street's already decided." Jack pulled out his folded sheet, smoothed it on the table, and tapped it with one weathered finger. "I've been keeping numbers too." There was laughter at first. But when they leaned closer, when they saw the charts, the precise predictions, the eerie accuracy of downturns and rebounds recorded years before they happened, the laughter died. Jack's voice was steady. "They want to close this place because they think it's cheaper to sell the land. But I can prove mathematically that the market's about to swing back. If we change how we run the furnace lines, cut waste the right way, we'll be profitable in less than a year, not just scraping by, thriving." A silence fell heavier than the steel beams they carried. "Jack," one man whispered, "are you saying you can save the plant?" Jack did not answer directly. He folded the paper again and slipped it back into his pocket. But his eyes, for the first time in decades, burned with something sharper than the furnace fire. The whistle blew for the next shift, but for Jack Morley, the real work had just begun. The news spread through the factory like a thunderclap. One sheet of paper on the bulletin board had shaken the ground more than 100 furnaces ever could. Men walked off their stations mid-shift, gloves still on, eyes vacant. Some cursed, their words sharp and bitter against the steel beams. Others simply slumped onto benches, staring at the floor as though the weight of the city had landed squarely on their backs. The smell of burnt metal lingered in the air, mingling with the sour taste of despair. Jack Morley watched it unfold from the shadows of the furnace bay. He saw Eddie Russo, 40 years old, father of 3, rip his name badge from his chest and hurl it against the wall. He saw young Chris Daniels, barely 22, clutch his phone with trembling fingers, already rehearsing the conversation he dreaded to have with his wife. "Honey, I lost my job." Detroit had lived this story too many times. Auto plants shuttered, neighborhoods hollowed, families left behind in rust and silence. The city carried scars like unhealed wounds, each closure a fresh cut. This factory had been one of the last holdouts, a symbol that not everything had been sold off or shipped overseas. Now even that symbol was dying. Jack lit a cigarette he shouldn't have. Smoking had been banned inside for years. But no one stopped him. Nobody cared anymore. The flame caught his face in a brief glow, and in that moment he looked less like a steelworker and more like a soldier standing at the ruins of a battlefield. As the lunch whistle blew, the men shuffled into the break room. Normally it was filled with the buzz of jokes, card games, the clang of microwaved lunches. Today it was silent, broken only by the creak of chairs. A foreman walked in, tie crooked, face pale. He cleared his throat. "Orders from headquarters, 6 months until closure. Severance packages will be mailed. Some of you might be reassigned to plants in Ohio or Indiana, most won't." The room erupted. Shouts, protests. A coffee mug shattered against the floor. Jack sat still, watching the foreman's lips move, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought of the numbers, his numbers, stacked in notebooks at home, each line a whisper of a truth nobody had cared to hear. He thought of the chart he drew last winter, predicting a rebound in steel demand tied to federal infrastructure bills. He thought of the formulas he had checked and rechecked while the world slept. The company wasn't closing because the math demanded it. It was closing because men in suits in New York had decided the land was worth more than the labor. To them, this was just another line on a balance sheet. To Jack, it was life itself. His friend Eddie slumped beside him, sweat beading on his forehead. "Jack, I can't lose this job. My boy starts college in the fall. What the hell am I supposed to do?" Jack took a long drag from his cigarette, exhaled slowly. For 30 years, He had swallowed his words, convinced that no one wanted to hear a steelworker talk about economics. But now, looking at Eddie's desperate face, at the broken men around him, he felt something stir in his chest. "Maybe," Jack said softly. "It doesn't have to end this way." Heads turned. The room fell quiet. Jack's voice was calm, steady, almost defiant. "They think the numbers are against us, but I've been watching those numbers longer than they've been alive, and I'm telling you, they're wrong." No one laughed this time. The foreman, unsettled, barked, "Sit down, Morley. This isn't your call." But Jack didn't sit. For the first time in years, he stood tall. His hard hat was scratched, his boots were cracked, but his presence filled the room like the sudden tightening of a drum. "Maybe it's not my call," he said, "but if they think they can close this place without a fight, they've forgotten what steelworkers are made of." Outside, the furnace roared on, as if the very walls of the factory were listening. And in that moment, for the first time since the announcement, hope flickered, small, fragile, but real. Jack's house was small, a weathered brick bungalow on the edge of Detroit, where the grass had grown thin and the paint peeled from the porch rails. Inside, the furniture was old but solid, the kind that outlived generations. On the kitchen table sat a lunch pail, a chipped coffee mug, and, hidden beneath a pile of utility bills, the thing Jack guarded more than anything else, his notebook. It wasn't much to look at. The cover was scarred, edges curled, the spine nearly broken from years of folding into back pockets. Smudges of graphite and oil covered its pages. A stranger would have tossed it into the trash without a second glance. But inside, between the grease stains and faded pencil marks, lived a world of precision. Graphs drawn by hand, rising and falling like heartbeats. Columns of numbers so tightly packed they looked like scripture. Curves tracing the rise of steel prices after the Iraq War. The dip after the financial crisis of 2008. The fragile climb after 2016. Jack had written them all. Every downturn, every surge, every cycle of despair and recovery, captured not by computer models, but by the eye and patience of a man who stood every day beside the furnace. He flipped to a page from 5 years ago. A rough prediction line curved upward, labeled Federal Infrastructure Push 2020s. The handwriting was shaky, but the numbers matched exactly with the bills now crawling through Congress. To Jack, it was no surprise. To the men in suits, it would be unthinkable that a steelworker with no degree, no office, had mapped the market's heartbeat better than their multi-million-dollar software. Jack's pencil, worn nearly down to the wood, scratched across a fresh page. He recalculated supply chains disrupted by overseas tariffs, then drew arrows toward construction demands in the Midwest. His figures whispered a truth no executive wanted to hear. The plant wasn't obsolete. It was on the cusp of a golden return. He leaned back in his chair, the springs creaking. For 30 years, this notebook had been his confession, his private cathedral. He had hidden it from everyone, his co-workers, his ex-wife, even his own children. What good would it do, showing numbers to people who only believed in pay stubs and degrees? But now, with closure looming, silence felt like betrayal. A memory flickered. His father, once a steelworker too, sitting at the same kitchen table. His father's words came back, heavy and unshakable. "Jack, the bosses will never see you as more than a pair of hands. That's all we are. Hands that can be replaced." Jack clenched his jaw. Maybe that had been true once, but maybe it didn't have to be anymore. He closed the notebook carefully, slid it into his lunch pail as if it were contraband. Tomorrow he would bring it to the plant. Tomorrow, the men would see. For the first time in years, Jack felt something like resolve, not the tired rhythm of survival, but the sharp, dangerous spark of defiance. The city outside was quiet, its skyline a silhouette of forgotten glory, but inside that battered notebook, in the hands of a man no one had ever truly seen, lay a map that could bend the fate of an entire factory, and Jack Morley was ready to unfold it. The next morning, the factory buzzed with unease. Every clang of metal, every hiss of steam felt heavier, as if the machines themselves knew they were being condemned to silence. Men spoke in whispers, not about production quotas, but about mortgages, about kids in college, about where else they could go when the plant died. Jack Morley carried his lunch pail as always, but inside, alongside his sandwich wrapped in wax paper, rested his notebook. Its presence weighed more than steel. At the morning meeting, a small crowd gathered around the bulletin board where another notice had been pinned. Transition team will arrive next week. The words were cold, clinical, the kind of language designed to strip dignity from men who had given their lives to this place. Jack's chest tightened. He looked around at the weary faces, then stepped forward. His voice, low but firm, cut through the muttering. "They're wrong," he said. Heads turned. Silence spread like fire through dry grass. Jack opened his pail, pulled out the battered notebook, and laid it flat on a workbench. Pages fell open, covered in hand-drawn graphs, numbers stacked like bricks in a wall. "This isn't just a plant dying," he continued. "This is Wall Street gutting us for profit. I've been tracking the cycles. The market's turning back up. If we adjust the way we run the furnace lines, if we cut waste where it bleeds most, we're profitable in less than a year. Not barely scraping by. Thriving." The men leaned closer, curiosity fighting with disbelief. Some nodded, remembering the uncanny accuracy of Jack's offhand predictions over the years. Others frowned, wary of hope. Before anyone could respond, a sharp voice sliced through the air. "What the hell is this?" It was Mr. Caldwell, the plant manager, mid-40s, polished suit, tie too tight for the factory floor. He strode forward, eyes narrowing at the sight of grease-stained pages spread across company property. "Numbers," Jack said evenly. "The real ones." Caldwell snorted. "Don't start playing Professor Morley. You're a steelworker, not an economist." Jack didn't flinch. "I've been watching this industry longer than you've been alive. Those charts you get from corporate, they're guesses made by men who've never smelled the furnace. These numbers are the truth." The room bristled. Workers shifted, some emboldened, others nervous. Caldwell's face reddened. "You think you're smarter than corporate? Than the MBAs running the numbers in New York?" He leaned in, voice dripping with contempt. "You've got no degree, no office, no right to talk. You're just a pair of hands, Morley. That's all you'll ever be." The words landed like a hammer. For a moment, the old truth Jack's father had spoken decades ago echoed in his ears. "That's all we are. Hands." But Jack's eyes didn't lower. He let the insult hang in the air, let the men around him feel it sting, then spoke with quiet steel. "If a pair of hands can see farther than the men in suits, maybe it's the suits who don't belong here." A ripple ran through the crowd. Some grinned despite themselves, others looked terrified. Caldwell, cornered by laughter he couldn't control, snapped the notebook shut and shoved it back toward Jack. "Get back to work," he barked, "or I'll have you written up." Jack took the notebook, slid it back into his pail. He didn't argue further. He didn't need to. The words had already been spoken, and the men had heard them. As he walked back to his station, Eddie Russo caught his arm. His voice was low, urgent. "Jack, you can't stop now. You've got something real. Don't let them bury it." Jack gave the faintest nod. The contempt of Caldwell had only fanned the fire. For 30 years, he had been invisible. Today, he had stepped into the open. And there was no going back. The day ended like any other. Whistles shrieking, furnaces cooling, men spilling out of the plant with shoulders hunched and boots heavy. But there was no laughter this time. No teasing about football scores or weekend fishing trips. Only silence and cigarette smoke trailing into the gray Detroit dusk. Jack walked with them, his lunch pail under one arm, his mind still burning. Caldwell's words replayed in his head, "You're just a pair of hands." The contempt had cut deep, but beneath the sting there was resolve. He knew he couldn't fight this battle alone. That night, he pushed open the door to Maggie's Tavern, a dive bar 3 blocks from the plant that had been the watering hole for steelworkers since the 60s. The neon sign flickered, half dead, but inside the place was alive with the clatter of pool balls and the low hum of country songs spilling from the jukebox. The air reeked of beer and memory. Jack slid onto a stool at the far corner. Before long, familiar faces drifted in. Eddie Russo, his best friend on the line, old Carl Jenkins, who'd worked the press since Reagan was in office, and a handful of younger guys, restless, angry, scared. They gathered around a table sticky with spilled drinks. The conversation was predictable. Complaints about management, bitterness at the company, dread about the future. Someone muttered about looking for work in Indiana. Another mentioned applying for disability. Jack listened, sipping slowly from his beer. Then, when the noise lulled, he set his glass down with a heavy thud. "What if," he said, "we don't let them close it?" The table went still. Eddie laughed nervously. "Jackson, come on, this isn't the movies. They've got lawyers, accountants, Wall Street behind them. We're just steelworkers," Jack cut in. His eyes swept across the group. Men who've kept this city breathing when everyone else walked away. Men who know the furnace better than the people making the decisions. And I've got the numbers to prove it. He pulled out the notebook, the same one Caldwell had mocked that morning, and laid it on the table. Pages fluttered open, covered in tight rows of figures, lines drawn with a steady hand, arrows pointing toward a future the company refused to see. "I can show them," Jack said. "I can prove the plant's not dead, but I can't do it alone. I need you to stand with me, to push back, to demand they listen." The men exchanged glances. Some leaned in, intrigued. Others shook their heads. Carl Jenkins snorted. "Jack, you're dreaming. They don't care about charts. They care about profit. Always have, always will." "But that's the point," Jack pressed. "This is profit. Real profit, if they give us the chance. They're about to sell off a living machine for scrap because they can't see what's coming. We can make them see, but only if we're united." Silence hung heavy. The jukebox clicked, switching songs. Finally, Eddie spoke. His voice was low, cautious. "You're asking us to gamble our lives on your math, Jack." Jack's gaze softened. He leaned closer, his voice steady but raw. "I'm asking you to gamble on yourselves, on the truth that we're worth more than they think. I've spent 30 years tracking the heartbeat of this industry, and I'm telling you, it's about to rise. Don't let them bury it before it breathes again." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, slowly, Eddie reached out and touched the edge of the notebook with his fingertips, as though it were something sacred. "I've seen you predict downturns before they hit," Eddie said. "Back in '08, you said the crash was coming. Everyone laughed, until it came. Maybe you're right again." The younger men shifted, restless hope flickering in their eyes. Carl shook his head, but even he didn't walk away. Jack closed the notebook and tucked it back into his coat. "Think about it. I'll fight whether you stand with me or not. But if we fight together, We might just win. He rose from the table, left a few crumpled bills for his beer, and walked into the Detroit night. Behind him, the men sat in uneasy silence. The notebook's image burned into their minds like sparks against steel. For the first time in years, they weren't just talking about endings. They were thinking about the possibility of a beginning. The conference room didn't belong to Detroit. It belonged to New York. Glass walls, steel trim, and leather chairs that had never known the grit of a factory floor. The executives from headquarters had flown in that morning, crisp suits, polished shoes, and expressions that looked more like masks than faces. At one end of the long mahogany table sat Mr. Caldwell, stiff-backed, lips tight. Beside him, two men in tailored suits scrolled through tablets. At the far end was a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair, Ms. Harrington, the vice president sent from Wall Street. Her presence alone made the room feel colder. And at the other end, standing awkwardly, lunch pail in hand, was Jack Morley. His boots left faint scuffs on the polished floor. His shirt smelled faintly of furnace smoke. He looked like an intruder, and in their eyes, that's exactly what he was. "Mr. Morley," Harrington began, voice clipped, "Caldwell tells me you've concerns about the plant closure." Jack set his lunch pail on the table, opened it, and carefully pulled out the notebook. The executives exchanged glances. To them, it looked ridiculous, a grease-stained relic placed among their gleaming tablets. But Jack opened it with the reverence of a priest unveiling scripture. "These are 30 years of numbers," he said, voice steady. "I've tracked every cycle of steel since I started on the line. Supply, demand, imports, exports. I can show you the rebound that's already started. If we restructure production, cut waste where it bleeds, we're profitable again in less than 12 months. He flipped to a page, pushing it toward them. The graphs rose and fell with uncanny precision. Here's 2008. I marked the crash 6 months before it hit. Here's 2016. Tariff spike. Called that too. And here, he tapped the newest page, is where we're headed. Infrastructure bills, construction demand. The market's about to roar back. If you close this plant now, you're not saving money. You're throwing away profit. For a moment, silence. Then Caldwell chuckled. It was the same mocking tone he'd used on the factory floor. You see this? Scribbles on paper. He thinks he's smarter than the analysts in New York. But Harrington didn't laugh. She leaned forward, eyes narrowing on the pages. For just a second, the mask slipped. She recognized the accuracy. She recognized the danger. Even if your projections are correct, she said carefully, decisions aren't made on lunchroom notebooks. They're made with verified data, peer-reviewed, audited. Jack met her gaze. Data is data. It doesn't matter if it comes from a computer in Manhattan or a steelworker's pocket. Numbers don't lie. Caldwell slammed his hand on the table. Enough! This is a waste of time. Morley, get back to your line before I have security walk you out. But Jack didn't flinch. He slid the notebook back toward himself, closed it gently, and tucked it into his pail. You can ignore me, he said. You can mock me. But you can't ignore the truth. And when this plant is gone and the market roars back, you'll remember the day a steelworker told you what was coming. The room went still. The executives shifted uncomfortably. Even Harrington's expression hardened, not with dismissal, but with unease. Jack lifted his pail, turned, and walked out. His boots echoed against the polished floor, leaving behind a silence thicker than smoke. For the men in suits, it was just another interruption. But for Jack Morley, it was the first step into the lion's den. And he hadn't been eaten alive. News of Jack Morley's outburst spread faster than molten steel poured into a mold. By the next morning, whispers rippled through the plant. He stood up to them, laid out his own charts, told Harrington they were wrong. For men who had worked decades without ever daring to speak back, it was a spark in the dark. But sparks are dangerous. And in boardrooms hundreds of miles away, men with polished shoes and sharper teeth decided that spark needed to be crushed. Wall Street didn't like loose ends. It didn't like risk. And Jack Morley, 58, steel dust under his nails, notebook full of inconvenient truths, was suddenly both. The first blow was subtle. On the factory floor, Caldwell began spreading rumors. "Morley's losing it," he told anyone who would listen. "Man's half crazy, thinks he's some kind of genius. Don't get caught up in his nonsense." Then came the memos. Warnings about insubordination, veiled threats of termination. Men saw Jack's name on the list, stamped in red, and some pulled away, afraid of being dragged down with him. But Jack kept working, steady as ever, sparks raining on his boots. When co-workers asked if the rumors were true, he only shrugged. Numbers don't care what they say. They are what they are. The second blow was louder. A week later, a headline appeared in the Detroit Free Press. "Morley Steel Plant. Closure necessary, say analysts." The article quoted anonymous executives, dismissing misguided voices, claiming the plant was salvageable. It spoke of unsustainable costs, obsolete production lines, and a changing global economy. Jack read it over his morning coffee, lips pressed tight. The words were polished, confident, and completely false. It wasn't analysis. It was propaganda. Wall Street had weaponized the press to bury him. The third blow was brutal. One evening, Jack found a letter taped to his front door. "Notice of investigation, unauthorized distribution of proprietary information." The company accused him of leaking sensitive data. If proven, it could mean not only losing his job, but losing his pension, everything he had left. Jack stood on his porch, letter trembling in his hands. For the first time, doubt gnawed at him. He thought of his children, grown now, distant, but still watching. He thought of Eddie, of the men who had touched his notebook with cautious hope. If he was destroyed, their hope might die too. He lit a cigarette, stared into the Detroit night. The city's skyline shimmered faintly, old factories like broken teeth against the sky. For a moment, he wondered if Caldwell had been right, if he was just a pair of hands daring to speak a language that wasn't his. But then he opened the notebook. There it was. 30 years of truth, scrawled in pencil, smudged by sweat and oil. The crash of 2008 predicted to the month. The rebound of 2016 charted before it came. The new line, rising, certain, unstoppable. Wall Street could spread lies, strip pensions, smear reputations, but they couldn't rewrite the math. Jack closed the notebook, tucked it back under his arm, and whispered to himself, "Let them come." For the first time, he wasn't afraid, because now it wasn't just about saving a plant. It was about proving that the truth, even when spoken by calloused hands, could stand against the tallest towers of Wall Street. It was late evening when the knock came at Jack Morley's door. He almost didn't answer. After weeks of pressure, threats, and sleepless nights, he had grown used to bad news arriving in envelopes or phone calls. But this time, it was different. On his porch stood a man in a tweed coat, his hair white as chalk, glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose. He carried no briefcase, no corporate badge, only a worn leather satchel bulging with papers. "Mr. Morley?" the man asked, his voice calm but steady. "My name is Professor Alan Keating, University of Michigan. I wonder if I might have a word." Jack hesitated, then opened the door. The professor stepped inside, removing his hat politely, his eyes wandering across the modest living room, the faded couch, the framed photographs of children long grown, the faint smell of steel dust that clung even here. Keating set his satchel down and pulled from it a sheaf of papers. Jack's notebook sat on top. "I believe this belongs to you," he said. Jack froze. "How did you—" Eddie Russo showed it to a colleague of mine. Word travels quickly in academic circles, especially when something extraordinary appears in the least expected places. Keating's eyes softened. "Mr. Morley, do you realize what you've done?" Jack shifted uncomfortably, crossing his arms. "I just wrote down what I saw. Supply, demand, cycles. Anyone paying attention could have done the same." Keating smiled faintly, shaking his head. "No, not anyone. You've constructed a predictive model of industrial economics with remarkable accuracy, without access to databases, without funding, without formal training. These equations—" He tapped the notebook reverently. "Some of them mirror work I've published. Others, well, others I wish I had thought of myself." For the first time in weeks, Jack felt his throat tighten, not from anger, but from something closer to disbelief. "You're saying it's real?" he asked quietly. "Real?" Keating's eyes gleamed. "It's brilliant." Jack turned away, pacing. The words echoed in his chest, colliding with decades of silence, decades of being told he was just a pair of hands. He wanted to believe them, but belief was dangerous. "They don't care about brilliance," Jack muttered. "The company, Wall Street. They'll bury it. Same as they bury us." "Perhaps," Keating conceded. "But truth has a way of surfacing. And you, Mr. Morley, are standing at a crossroads. You can let them dismiss you, or you can force them to listen. Not just with numbers, but with the weight of lives depending on those numbers." Jack looked at the professor. In his eyes there was no condescension, no mockery. Only respect. The kind of respect Jack had never once seen in a manager's gaze. Keating stood, gathering his satchel. "I cannot fight your battles for you. But know this, you are not alone. If they come at you with lies, I will stand beside you with truth. Sometimes one voice is ignored, two voices speaking the same truth from different worlds that can move mountains." Jack walked him to the door. The professor stepped out into the Detroit night, his figure fading into the glow of a street lamp. For a long time, Jack stood on the porch, the notebook heavy in his hands. The city hummed with the quiet of factories gone dark, but somewhere deep inside, a new sound began to rise, like steel being hammered into shape. For the first time, Jack felt something close to faith. Not in Wall Street, not in managers, but in the possibility that his voice, long silenced, might finally be heard. The day of reckoning came on a gray Monday morning. Rain slicked the streets of Detroit, dripping from rusted gutters, pooling in potholes. Outside the plant gates, hundreds of workers stood shoulder to shoulder, their breath rising in white clouds against the chill. They carried no torches, no weapons, only signs painted in hurried strokes. "We are not just hands." "Numbers don't lie." "Save our plant." At the front stood Jack Morley, his dented hard hat pulled low, notebook clutched in one hand. Beside him was Professor Keating, his tweed coat soaked through, glasses misted by rain. The image was almost absurd. A steelworker and a professor, two men from different worlds standing together before the gates of power. Inside the conference hall, executives gathered around a long table. Caldwell fumed, red-faced, whispering about mutiny. Ms. Harrington sat in silence, her expression unreadable. Cameras were everywhere. The local news, union reporters, even national outlets. For once, the boardroom could not hide behind closed doors. Jack was ushered in. He felt the weight of every eye, every lens. His boots squeaked on the polished floor, leaving muddy prints like scars across their perfect world. Harrington gestured stiffly. "Mr. Morley, you've requested to present your case. The floor is yours." Jack set the notebook on the table, opened it to the newest page. His hand did not shake. "For 30 years I've watched this industry," he began, his voice steady. "I've seen it fall, rise, and fall again. Every time they told us it was over. But every time steel found a way back. Not because of Wall Street, but because of us, the men who breathe this furnace air, the women who keep these lines alive. This plant isn't obsolete. It's on the cusp of renewal. Here's the proof." He laid out chart after chart, each curve matching real market data, each prediction backed by a lifetime of observation. He pointed to infrastructure projects, tariff cycles, demand curves, every line written in pencil but stronger than any corporate forecast. Keating stepped forward, placing a hand on the notebook. His voice carried the weight of authority. "As an economist, I confirm these models are not fantasy. They are rigorous, insightful, and accurate. Frankly, more accurate than much of what passes for analysis on Wall Street." The room erupted in murmurs. Caldwell slammed his hand on the table. "This is nonsense. He's a steelworker, not a strategist. You can't gamble a corporation on one man's scribbles." But before Harrington could reply, the sound from outside surged. A thunderous chant, rolling like steel drums. "Save our plant! Save our plant!" The glass windows rattled. Executives exchanged uneasy glances. Cameras caught every flicker of doubt. Harrington's eyes lingered on Jack. For the first time, her mask slipped. Not into disdain, but into something colder. Fear. Fear that if they ignored him, and he was right, history would mark them as fools. She leaned back, voice deliberate. "The board will review this evidence. Until then, the closure is suspended." The room gasped. Caldwell nearly choked, but outside the chant erupted into cheers. Men who had walked in broken now raised their fists in triumph. Jack closed the notebook, holding it tight to his chest. He knew this wasn't the end. Suspended wasn't saved. But for the first time in months, the plant had a heartbeat again. As he walked out into the rain, Eddie grabbed his shoulder, tears cutting tracks down his dirty face. "You did it, Jack. You gave us a chance." Jack looked at the crowd, at the factory looming like a giant bruised but unbroken. He felt no pride, no victory, only the solemn weight of what still lay ahead. But in that moment, beneath the storm, surrounded by men who finally believed they were worth more than Wall Street's ledger, Jack Morley was no longer just a steelworker. He was a leader, and the decision they had forced today would echo far beyond Detroit. The factory whistle blew at dawn. For decades it had been the same sound, shrill, metallic, a call to labor. But on this morning, it rang different. It rang like survival, like defiance, like hope. Men filed through the gates with heads held higher than they had in months. Some slapped Jack on the back, others nodded quietly, their gratitude unspoken but heavy in the air. The plant was not saved forever. No one was foolish enough to believe that. But it had been given a reprieve. 6 months, a year, maybe longer. Enough time for work to matter again. Enough time for children to keep their college plans, for mortgages to be paid, for dinners to remain on tables. Jack Morley walked among them. The same dented hard hat pulled low, the same boots cracked at the soles. He did not lead the parade, did not raise his fist, did not bask in the cheers. He simply punched the clock and took his place at the line as he had done for 30 years. Yet something had changed. When Jack bent to adjust the furnace gauges, men watched with a new kind of respect. When he scribbled numbers on a scrap of paper, they no longer laughed. They leaned closer, eager to understand. His notebook, once hidden, mocked, nearly destroyed, was now treated like gospel. Eddie Russo found him at lunch break, sitting alone on the bench with his sandwich. "You know, Jack," he said, voice thick with emotion, "you're a hero now." Jack shook his head, eyes fixed on the steam curling from his coffee. "Heroes wear crowns. I'm just a man with a pencil." But Eddie pressed on. "You gave us a voice. You showed them we're more than hands. That matters, Jack. It matters more than you know." Jack said nothing. He only opened the notebook, flipped to a fresh page, and began to write again. That evening, as the men left the plant, the city lights blinked on across Detroit. To outsiders, nothing had changed. The same rusted bridges, the same shuttered factories, the same weary skyline. But in one small corner, in one plant spared from silence, something had shifted. Not because Wall Street allowed it, not because executives found their conscience, but because one man, invisible for 3 decades, refused to let the truth die in the dark. Jack Morley would never grace magazine covers. He would never headline conferences. His name would not be taught in universities. But in the memory of the men who worked beside him, in the children whose futures had been saved by his stubborn numbers, he was something rarer than a celebrity. He was proof. Proof that genius can live in calloused hands. Proof that dignity can be carved from rust and fire. Proof that sometimes the strongest crowns are the ones never worn. And as he walked home under the Detroit sky, lunch pail in hand, notebook tucked safe beneath his arm, Jack Morley allowed himself a small, fleeting smile. The fight wasn't over, but for now, the furnace still roared. And so did hope. Thank you for staying with Jack's story until the very end. If it touched you, it's because you know the truth. Dignity is not measured in titles or degrees, but in the hands that build, the hearts that endure, and the voices that refuse to be silenced. Every share, every comment, every subscription keeps these stories alive. So if you felt something tonight, let us know where you're watching from. And if you believe in honoring the forgotten men and women who shaped our world, please subscribe and ring the bell, so together we can keep telling stories that matter.